Please be seated. Well, in this story, Jesus seems to be telling his listeners that it is not important to wash your hands. I can see you mothers out there squirming in your seats. I see you. Wash your hands. Brush your teeth. Eat your vegetables. Right? That is what my mother always told me, and she was never wrong about these kinds of things. She would say, pretend that your hands are two giant octopuses wrestling each other to the death. She had it right. Now, certainly, Jesus had something other than hygiene in mind. Rather than hygiene, Jesus is here talking about the tendency of human beings to measure a person's faith and status based on whether they conform to unexamined cultural preferences, assumptions, practices, and rituals. He is insisting that foundational commandments, the greatest of which is to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and mind, and your neighbor as yourself, be the measurement. The context here is a few well-off religious authorities who happened to be Pharisees criticizing Jesus' followers, common people, who had neither the time nor opportunity to always deal with all the details of ritual cleansing and the like. Now, please, don't paint all Pharisees with the same negative brushstroke. Here, Jesus is speaking to a specific a few that happened to be among those Pharisees that measured a person's faith and status by whether they strictly adhered to ritualistic traditions, regardless whether doing so would violate a commandment. In Matthew's version of this story, Jesus not only mentions the commandment to love God and one's neighbor, but also that God desires mercy rather than ritual. Here, a ritual that could be impractical and burdensome to the poor and working common Jew of the time. As a group, Pharisees engaged in much that is commendable and consistent with Jesus' teaching and conduct. Some were his followers. You see, Pharisees were part of a movement, a social movement, that democratized the Jewish faith at a time when worship had become geographically anchored to the temple in Jerusalem, a place that Jews living elsewhere were unable to worship at, absent incurring significant expense and the difficulty of travel. And Jews lived throughout the Roman Empire. So the Pharisees offered those unable to participate in temple worship another means of being in right relationship with God, namely by observing traditional purity codes and ritual practices in their homes and villages. Unfortunately, as here, some Pharisees stigmatize those failing to always follow culturally evolved traditions without examining whether in context, failing to always do so should be excused. So, what does this story have to do with us? What, if any, relevance does it have to our present lives and way of being in the world as followers of Jesus? Well, I suggest to you that in each and every historical era, each and every one of them, followers of Jesus fell into the trap of favoring culturally derived traditions, beliefs, and rituals over essential teachings and modeling that Jesus left us with. The challenge of every generation of Christians is to discern when its present religious and secular traditions, practices, and rituals are faithful expressions of Jesus and when they are not. And then we have to decide both individually and as a community what to do. Unfortunately, like these particular Pharisees, we often clothe traditional rituals, practices, and assumptions in the vestments of religious orthodoxy, even when inconsistent with the teachings of Jesus. And the history of American Christianity is replete with examples of this. And we collectively need to make certain that our children and future generations are aware of this history and learn from it. Relying on denominational dogma to keep women in what they refer to as divinely determined, limited roles. Most American Christian churches still continue to prohibit full inclusion of women, despite Jesus' ministry and the time that he was here and in the early church. Our church did not fully embrace women in ministry until 1976 and prohibited women from serving on vestries and at General Convention until a few years before that. These are human-created rules, human-created traditions and assumptions that continue to lead to unholy outcomes when followed, as here, in eras they are unsuited for. The collect that was assigned today addresses this by saying, increase in us true religion. It is a helpful qualifier. Plenty of us have religion, but is it true religion? And how would we ever know? The Epistle of James today gives us a pretty big hint. Religion that is pure and undefiled before God the Father is it to care for orphans and widows in their distress and to keep oneself unstained by the world. The first piece of this is clear, even if it's not always obvious how exactly to go about that. Caring for orphans and widows was a metaphor for all those in that culture that needed caring for. This is where we should begin our self-criticism. This is how we can sense if our religion is on the right track or not. Are we taking care of the most vulnerable among us? For the last decade, doing so has been at the heart of our identity here at St. Michael's. But James's next instruction, to keep oneself unstained by the world, is a little less clear. How do we keep unstained in the eyes of God? Is such purity even possible? Has it ever been? How do we keep ourselves undefiled, unstained by the world? What defiles us? The things that go in us, or what comes out of us? Jesus takes a clear stand. It's what comes out of us that stains us. In other words, it's a condition related to the human heart. From our hearts, what was understood to be the absolute epicenter of rationality and will during the first century and in Jewish tradition, flows all sorts of things. Wonderful, creative, beautiful, and good things. As Jesus points out, but there are other things. Theft, murder, adultery, deceit, envy, slander, and pride, just to name a few. Now there's a poem by Mary Oliver called Of the Empire that illustrates a specific form of modern defilement. She says in part about our generation, we will be known as a culture that feared death and adored power, that tried to vanquish insecurity for the few and cared little for the penury of the many. They will say of us that in those days, the state of the heart was small and hard and full of meanness. Now, since Jesus so pointedly names the problem, you might be wondering what in the world is the solution. Who can take our hearts and make them big and soft? I believe it occurs when we engage in the on again, off again, 2 steps forward, 1 step back effort to orient our day-to-day way of living to be focused on the teachings and actions of God revealed as Jesus. It is when we try to treat everyone as if they are sacred until the sacred in them remembers. When God walked among us as Jesus, we saw that his heart was not small or hard or mean. It was large, it was soft, it was kind. His heart was beating for the orphans and widows, the ones who felt forgotten, for the prisoners, for the foreigners, for all of us who have forgotten that we have hearts in the first place. His heart, because it was soft, tender, broke over and over again. It broke when he saw how we treated one another. It broke when he saw how we treated the poor. It broke when we elevated human tradition above his teachings and actions. But when his heart broke, it did not harden like ours do sometimes. It did not wither or shrink or shrivel up like a sad remnant of itself. It expanded in compassion. It swelled with generosity. It broke like a loaf of bread divided for the sake of many. God's own heart continues to break, but it does so for and with our hearts. We can reorient and renew ourselves. Our hearts can beat to a different sort of rhythm. Our hearts can grow large, soft, and kind. So yes, the story we heard today continues to be an important lesson for us followers of Jesus, both individually and as a community. As Jesus said to these Pharisees, culturally created rituals, traditions, and assumptions can become the servants of hypocrisy when they contradict the values of Jesus' teachings and conduct. As followers of Jesus, we must step outside ourselves and be self-critical. We must continually examine our beliefs, assumptions, rituals, and practices, in light of what Jesus said and did. And the temporal context, this is important, that we find ourselves in. This is not first century in Jerusalem. What Jesus taught and the way he lived, that set us free to see ourselves from God's perspective. By the way he lived, who he cared for, and his willingness to sacrifice for others. Jesus showed us the way to live with integrity so that our beliefs and actions are congruent. As we say in Psalm 51 and in our prayer book, create in us clean hearts, O God, and renew a right spirit within us. Amen.